Hi everybody, this is David Sykes from PRMA Consulting. Welcome to our webinar on launching with Phase 2 single-arm data, real-world evidence and other strategies to support HTA and market access. I'm joined by my colleague Jan McKendrick. Jan will quickly introduce herself and then pass back to me.
Hi everybody, my name's Jan. I'm a clinical trial statistician by background with significant industry experience, particularly in HTA submissions, and I lead the real-world evidence activities here at PRMA Consulting.
Thanks, Jan. So thanks everybody for taking the time to join us on this very topical webinar today. We are just going to introduce you to the concept of Phase 2 single-arm submissions in terms of the regulatory background, and then we're going to identify some of the payer concerns and issues, and Jan will take us through some real-world examples of how the Phase 2 single-arm packages have been reviewed by HTA agencies, and also outline some potential mitigation strategies that you could be considering. So before we formally start, I'd just like to go through this slide in terms of how the audience can participate. We'll go through the presentation, and at the end of the presentation there will be a Q&A session. Please feel free, using the GoToWebinar control panel you can see on this slide, to submit your questions. We will collate those throughout the webinar, and then we'll come back to those at the Q&A session at the end. Any questions we don't get round to answering, we will come back with answers for those individuals. So I'd just like to start by framing our experience in the oncology area. This webinar has been built on many years' experience in the market access and oncology landscape at PRMA. We've worked across a broad range of tumours, as you can see on this slide, both in hem-onc and solid tumours. As a group as well, we also have a significant experience of working on several Phase 2 single-arm programs, from Phase 1 through regulatory approval to HTA and PNR submissions. So a lot of the things we're going to talk about today, we've lived and breathed over the last few years. Just before we go into the Phase 2 single-arm piece, I just wanted to touch on a key slide from last month's webinar, where we talked about key emerging trends in oncology market access. And you can see there's a lot of core issues there that I'm sure all the audience are grappling with. And all of these issues that are outlined are as relevant to Phase 2 single-arm submissions as they are to Phase 3 randomized comparative submissions as well. So we're going to be coming back to a lot of these issues as we go through the rest of the presentation. So firstly, I just want to start with the regulatory framework that we're currently operating in. So there's a number of regulatory initiatives in place to support patients getting access to life-saving drugs earlier than ever. And this slide shows the specific programs at the FDA and the EMA to facilitate that earlier access to medicines. And we can see that that's actually translated through into a number of approvals for products based on Phase 2 single-arm data packages. You can see there's significantly more in the US through the FDA than there are in Europe. But even in Europe, there's still about 6 products there that we've highlighted. It's not comprehensive, that list. We've highlighted some of the key ones there. If we look at those data packages that have been submitted to the regulators, they're usually driven by surrogate endpoint data. They have limited or absent OS data, an absence of HRQL evaluated at the regulatory level, and none of those examples have used historical control data in their assessments. Interestingly, we've seen a couple of recent examples where regulators have used historical controls to frame or contextualize clinical benefit, this being usually the response rate. Typically, with phase 3 data packages, the payers are much less dependent on the regulatory assessment. But what we've seen is a couple of examples where with phase 2 single arm data packages, the payers are much more dependent and focused on what the regulators say. So it's of the utmost strategic value to ensure that regulatory assessments using real-world evidence to set up key concepts that will carry through into HTA and P&R assessments. And those key strategic concepts revolve around unmet need, the lack of available treatment options and comparators, and the use of historical controls to contextualize or frame relative treatment effect. Market access and HUR groups can play a highly strategic role in developing evidence to support these concepts that hit both regulatory and HTA P&R stakeholder needs. Now, we're all familiar with the areas of focus in HTA, but what we see is when it comes to submissions based on phase 2 single arm, effectively the same requirements are in place. So the payers are acting pretty much the same as they would do with a phase 3 comparative package, albeit there's some kind of trade-off around potentially higher unmet need there. And you can see from this graphic here that there's a number of key areas that Jan will come back to in her slides around who is the patient population, what is the clinical value of this product, the economic value, and the place in therapy. The place in therapy, most countries outside of Germany under an orphan designation and abbreviated submission will still be focusing on relative treatment effect. So that's going to be a huge area to try and help payers understand the relative treatment effect. There's obviously a lot of areas we need to cover in today's webinar, so we're not really going to touch the economic or cost effectiveness aspect to phase 2 single arms, but feel free to send in questions. So as payers are confronted with more limited data packages and higher levels of uncertainty about outcomes, how are they dealing with it? And this is remembering the framework that their expectations are pretty much the same as they are for a phase 3 study. So we're starting to see the assessment of incremental clinical benefit is limited de facto just because of the paucity of the evidence base, and Jan will explore how you can augment some of that story and improve the value proposition around that. Because of the focus on intermediate or surrogate endpoints, there's more focus on AEs and PROs or health-related quality of life. We're seeing payers restrict the reimbursed population. We're seeing payers want to come back to the evaluations within a specified period of time, 1, 2, or 3 years, and expectations around additional evidence as well. What these limited data packages are offering means that there's a weaker payer value proposition by definition, which leads to suboptimal pricing outcomes. And the commercial trade-off for manufacturers becomes, we can achieve earlier access, but for how much lower a price do we achieve that access? And that's the key commercial trade-off for manufacturers to think through. So how are we going to approach the identification of challenges? So in the next section, we want to highlight a number of examples of how payers have evaluated phase 2 single-arm packages. The framework for this is the PRMA Health Check tool. This is an interactive tool using the submission requirements and methodological guidance from scope countries to address whether a program can meet these evidentiary requirements. The heat map you can see on the slide identifies vulnerabilities and gaps in the evidence base. So we'll use the PRMA Health Check to highlight the challenges laid out by HTA in the context of a phase 2 single arm, and then inform our assessment of potential mitigation strategies that manufacturers can consider. So at this point in the presentation, I'm now going to hand over to my colleague Jan, who will take us through those challenges and mitigation strategies in more detail. Thanks, Jan.
Thanks, David. So I think it's clear that the issues around relative efficacy and the comparative nature of the focus for payers and the lack of data in the regulatory package are quite obvious, but there are some other real significant challenges that payers face, which is no different than if they had phase 3 data. So for example, identifying the patient population. Payers are still trying to manage risk and trying to mitigate their risk. The lack of a comparator gives them a less ideal scope and of the position of the therapy. So understanding the exact patient and potentially their unmet need is very important. And establishing the standard of care, as David said, the comparisons are still relative. So understanding the comparator treatment and the place of the treatment in therapy. So those are two issues that we've identified that could actually be addressed from pre-launch real-world evidence. And there has been a tendency over recent times to focus on real-world evidence as a means of generating treatment outcomes data, but it can be a very effective tool to help in the pre-launch setting, and we're going to look at some examples of those as well. The third area we're going to look at is, in fact, relative efficacy. I think it's such a key part of the payer assessment that it's not something that we can omit. So on the screen what we have is some examples of very specific questions from the HTA agencies. The examples we're using today are from France, Germany and the UK, just as examples of places we can see different products having been assessed and have a look at the different outcomes. I think there may also, we've seen examples of a tendency for the efficacy to be overlooked with the assumption that if you can get regulatory approval based on this package, the payers will also look favourably. And I'll take you through some examples of where we've seen that happen and seen some significant challenges along the way too. So first of all, I'm going to start with identifying the patient population. So payers still require clarity on this. It might not be abundantly clear to them. This may be a therapy area that's much smaller. The target patient population has to be more clearly defined, and they may not just be quite so familiar with this. It may be that they have a lack of understanding of the unmet need in terms of the mortality and the morbidity in the patient population. And certainly how the patient population aligns to clinical practice and economic implications of perhaps not treating that patient population also become really important. Clearly this is not a feature of all healthcare systems. As David said, in the German system under an orphan designation, this is not really something that comes into play, but certainly in France and the UK systems, that's something that needs to be considered. So we're going to take a look at a couple of examples of where real-world evidence and other strategies have been used as part of the HTA submission. So I'm going to start with the example of Adcentris. So the regulatory approval was based on two separate subgroups of patients, and through the process at SMC, which is the example in this case, clinicians that were consulted did confirm the unmet need in that treatment population. That was both in terms of limited treatment options for those patients, but also the potential that treatment with this therapy could bridge to potential other therapies that may benefit certain groups of patients. So it was clear from the interaction with clinicians during the process that there was a place for this therapy, and as a result, the SMC did accept the use of this product in clinical practice. That's a great example of where the clinician opinion has clearly articulated that there is an unmet need. There may be an opportunity to be proactive about providing that data rather than leaving it to the process which generated it. The second example is Iclusig. So this is a treatment where, again, during the evaluation process, both in France and in Scotland, clinical experts were consulted. And interestingly, in this case, they identified different levels of unmet need depending on the patient's subpopulation. And that was a difference both in terms of unmet need and in terms of treatment options. And again, clinicians were able to verify this unmet need and these differentiators. And as you can see, the result in France was that there were three different ASMR ratings depending on the subpopulation. And again, in SMC in Scotland, the product was accepted for use. The interesting thing again in Scotland, the unmet need was accepted, and importantly, the burden to patients and their families was considered in that decision-making process. As a result of those factors, the SMC allowed wider uncertainty in their economic evaluation of the data, and ultimately the product was accepted for use. So in terms then, those are a couple of examples of where we've seen the importance of identifying the patient population and unmet need. So it's important perhaps just to reflect on ways that those challenges could be mitigated. So through those two examples, it became very clear that the clinician opinion was very, very important. And in the examples I used, the clinician engagement was during the HTA process. There certainly could be an opportunity to engage with clinicians before the HTA process and use their opinions to help robustly generate data that show the positioning of the product. So you can engage with clinicians in a number of ways. That could be through face-to-face meetings, it could be through advisory boards, or perhaps there's a need for a survey of clinicians who treat these patients already to understand not only how they treat the patients, but why they treat the patients that way and understand their decision-making processes. That may also help to establish who the correct patient is for this product and what their clinical need is, all in relation to current clinical practice at the moment. A point also not to be overlooked is the unmet need in terms of economic burden, either to patients, their carers, or their families. It certainly was a factor that played a role in one of the reviews by SMC, and it should be considered and could be considered, again through using real-world evidence to capture the unmet need in these patients, understand the context in which the treatment is being placed, and the levers that might be affected by an effective treatment. The second area we're going to look at is establishing the standard of care. So again, as we've discussed, payers do need to understand the position of this new treatment in the treatment pathway. From their perspective, a treatment usually displaces something, and it's very important to them to understand what that something is. Now, certainly treatment guidelines can give some framework for that, but in a lot of the cases where we've seen phase 2 single-arm data, the patient population is relatively small, and it may be that treatment guidelines are just not quite specific enough to give the payers the confidence that they understand the patient. In the case of phase 2 single-arm data, of course, there's no trial comparator, so there is no anchor point for a payer to understand where this new treatment fits. So in a phase 3 comparative study, even if the comparator is not perhaps the appropriate one for your country, at least it's giving an anchor point to a payer who will understand where that fits. That's part that's missing with phase 2 data, and it does cause a real challenge to payers, who ultimately are trying to determine the value in terms of what interventions are displaced. So again, we're going to look at some examples of reviews by HTA bodies which have looked at establishing the standard of care. Okay, the first example then is Arzera in refractory CLL. In this submission, the submission to NICE, the manufacturer did develop a treatment algorithm that clearly positioned the new treatment within a treatment pathway, although there had not been an appropriate treatment pathway beforehand. And through that process, they established that there was no consensus on the standard of care. Now, this treatment pathway was developed through a series of one-on-one interviews with clinicians, yet again highlighting the really critical role that clinicians' opinion has in these HTA submissions, especially in cases where there's a lack of definitive guidelines for the patient population. In this case, the treatment pathway had actually resulted in NICE accepting that best supportive care was a comparator and that an external data source for that was appropriate. However, ultimately, the outcome was not recommended by NICE. So even when you take all the steps to try to mitigate, it may not result in a positive outcome, but it certainly was looked on favourably that the manufacturer had gone to those steps. The second example is Bosulif. In this example, yet again, the treatment pathways based on clinical opinions played a real critical role in the assessment. So the study, the regulatory study that this approval was based on did not set out to address the needs of the regulators. So the regulatory indication actually ended up being a subgroup of the study that was the pivotal study, and that was not at the manufacturer's request from what we can see. So the licensed population ended up being a subgroup of their phase 2 study. So in France then, that was not looked upon particularly favourably, where the French decided there was confusion between the data in the package and the potential place in therapy. And in NICE in the UK, the positioning by the manufacturer was not felt to align with the positioning that the clinical experts brought into the process were suggesting. So the line of therapy from the trial data was misaligned with where NICE expected this product to be used. And that led to some confusion and concern around the comparator. So ultimately, the NICE outcome was a not recommended. Another interesting point to note about the French submission was that during the process, the Transparency Commission identified an emerging comparator that had recently been approved and questioned why that was not included as a comparator in some form within the submission. So I think, again, the opinion of clinicians and their ability to forward look is very, very important. So again, let's just recap on some key learnings then in terms of standard of care. It's absolutely critical to establish country-specific treatment pathways. So we've seen examples where that has been carried out in one country, and clearly we've seen where one drug has been viewed very differently in two different countries. So establishing the pathway specific to that country is very important. And as I've alluded to, the lack of evidence quite often around these specific patient populations may lead you to have to generate some data to help the payers understand how this treatment will align with current practice. So again, we're talking about leveraging clinicians in one form or another. So gathering real-world evidence from them, either through quantitative studies or qualitative studies, and that may be through clinician surveys, it may be through engaging clinicians that have a disease registry, it may be through engaging clinicians who have a database of patients, but certainly the clinician opinion appears to be quite an important component of some of these decisions. And I think not only establishing the treatment pathway, but demonstrating the lack of alternative comparator. We've seen examples where the manufacturer has attempted to say there should be no comparator, and the HTA body have questioned that. So again, rather than leaving those issues to chance, there's an opportunity to be proactive and provide them some robust evidence to mitigate that opportunity. Okay, the third and last area we're going to look at today is determining relative efficacy. So as David has said, payers are focused on relative efficacy with a phase 2 study or a phase 3 study. In this case, with phase 2 data, there is no comparator arm, so the payers have no context in which to place the results of their phase 2 studies. And we've seen examples where the HTA bodies have looked back to the regulatory bodies for advice on how to put these results in context. Is this magnitude of response sufficient? If that information is not contained within the regulatory package, that's another problem for a payer. They're now left with an issue of interpreting the magnitude of an effect, unlikely to be a final outcome like overall survival, and more likely to be a response rate, which is more difficult to put in context. And clearly with single-arm data, traditional analytic approaches such as network meta-analysis are no longer possible. A single-arm study does not belong to a network. So payers still have this issue about understanding relative efficacy, no matter whether it's phase 2 data or not. Payers are also very focused on rewarding survival benefits. So many of the agencies we're talking about today are looking to long-term outcomes. In a phase 2 single-arm study with an accelerated approval program, it's likely that those data in the package are actually either immature or based on intermediate endpoints. So again, the payer is trying to understand how those intermediate endpoints map to the longer-term data, and potentially in a situation of lack of clarity with a very specific patient population and with no comparator arm to help them do that. As we mentioned earlier, in this context, payers are looking to manage their risks and their uncertainties. So in some ways, a more complete evidence package actually is even more beneficial in a phase 2 setting. So in the absence of comparative data and where you don't have long-term outcomes, it may be even more important to look to a broader range of outcomes to give payers the confidence that the data they're seeing in your regulatory trial actually are mirrored in a number of different outcomes measures. So again, we've got some examples with this. So the first example is Bushliff again. This is quite an interesting example where a similar data package resulted in very different outcomes, but all fairly negative in that neither France nor Germany nor NICE were particularly positive. And again, this was a lot to do with the subgroup in the study not quite aligning with where the payers thought things would happen in practice. A couple of real specifics though. For the NICE submission, the manufacturers did actually go to the bother of qualitatively describing survival and progression data on comparator studies that may have been a potential to align with the study that they had. But unfortunately, the data that they had for those comparators was not sufficient in terms of the volume of outcomes for NICE to be convinced that the comparison was robust. So that unfortunately ended up in a not recommended. And with Germany, the concern was that the subgroup of patients who did meet the license indication was just too small for them to be able to say anything other than additional benefit was non-quantifiable. The next example is with our ZERA. So in this submission, both to NICE and to the Transparency Commission, the manufacturer included both an interim analysis from a single-arm study along with external data, which provided outcomes for other treatment options. And certainly in the case of NICE, that data was uncovered fairly systematically and robustly. There was a systematic review. The estimate of outcome for the comparator was conducted, and that estimate was validated with external data. However, none of that external data was comparative, and ultimately NICE decided there was still too much uncertainty around the treatment effect, resulting in a not recommended. The next example is actually very different. So the first one with our ZERA, there was substantial effort, certainly in the NICE approval process, to provide that evidence. Zidelig was a slightly different case. The manufacturer tried to argue that the comparison wasn't feasible because there were no other studies that had similar patients. Unfortunately, that was not accepted by the GBA, where they could have given a higher rating. They decided that they should have done a comparison. It was expected, it hadn't been conducted, and therefore there was no additional benefit proven. A slightly different perspective on the UK for Zidelig was actually that the comparator indication with the one that we're talking about here did have phase 3 data, and the Cancer Drugs Fund in the UK then decided it should have been possible to conduct a phase 3 study in this indication, and therefore not recommended that there was no funding associated with the drug. So just to recap then, in terms of determining relative effectiveness and efficacy, what strategies could you take? Well, certainly providing context for the comparison of treatment outcomes. It should be an exercise in establishing the relevance of a historical control. It may not be possible, there may be limitations, but going through the exercise of doing that and showing that to the HTA agencies would go some way to mitigating their concerns. That historical control could come from a number of real-world sources, again, registries, databases, but the critical thing will be to make sure that the methodology that's associated with it is robust. We have seen examples where historical control has been identified, but the analytical methods have been criticized. And external data can always be used to triangulate the outcomes. So again, just providing the payers with as much context as possible so that they can put the results into their heads. Another couple of things to think about are making sure that it's not that the relationship between intermediate and final endpoints is not forgotten. It is still a thing that payers will look for critically with phase 2 data. So perhaps look to model the relationship or validate it with clinicians using surveys or Delphi panels. Again, the methodology is pretty important. And in terms of the value proposition, it's very important to give context to the limited data you may have in your phase 2 package. So identify payer-relevant outcomes and generate the data through a proactive strategy, whether within your trial program or without. Certainly enhancing and augmenting your data package will go some way to alleviating the concerns of payers.
Great, thanks, Jan. So I'm just going to open up to some questions now for the next 3 or 4 minutes, and then we'll summarize. So, Jan, first question from the floor. What real-world data could you use and collect to understand the economic burden and caregiver perspective?
I think certainly the challenges with economics are probably not much different methodologically with phase 3 and phase 2 data, but the uncertainty around it is very, very different. So in terms of gathering data, the bit we haven't talked about today then would be costing data. So certainly some proactive strategies to collect that through the use of real-world data sources would augment the things we've already talked about extrapolating long-term outcomes. But I think from an economics perspective, the thing that you have to be more conscious of is that payers are still risk averse. You've given them a limited data package and you need to help them manage that uncertainty.
Yeah, thanks, Jen. And the next part of that is around the caregiver perspective. So perhaps what I'd say there is that can be assessed through a survey of caregivers across countries. The point I would make, though, is the value of that data to different stakeholders and how that information is going to be used needs to be critically evaluated as a first step. The second question then is, what are the considerations when developing a CE model in this context?
So I think we've talked about some of these already. You're working with a more limited data package, so the certainty with which you can predict longer term outcomes is less than with phase 3 data, because you have usually a smaller sample size. So I think looking externally to data sources that can enhance yours in terms of understanding that long-term value, so things like registries, databases, chart reviews, something to help you give more context to that long-term survival. That will be a critical part of modelling.
Yeah, okay, thanks. In terms of clinician surveys, how do they come through? What is their role in HTA submissions?
And we've had a good look at a lot of the HTA submission templates and have really identified that there are opportunities to provide data to answer some of the questions in those submission documents. So for example, if you're trying to describe where your treatment fits into a pathway, if that doesn't exist for now, you can generate that through clinician surveys. Clinicians are, we've seen through the examples today, clinicians are a great source of information, and engaging them anyway is a good idea, and engaging them to give you their clinical opinion seems to be a good way to proceed with that.
Great, thanks. A question here about payer-relevant outcomes, so perhaps I'll take that. Obviously, payers are looking at OS as the gold standard for these phase 2 single-arm contexts. They're typically based on response rates, so patients are looking at the correlation between intermediate and final outcomes. I think the value drivers of HRQL and AEs in terms of intensity, duration, and patient relevance become even more important in that context. So Jan, just a final question here. Apologies to the people we've not got round to. A lot of these situations we're talking about are small patient populations with limited numbers of KOLs. We've seen recent examples where agencies have gone outside of the clinical speciality to get feedback on the potential product profiles. How do we mitigate against this?
So I think one of the important things is to engage the clinicians, that if you can produce a body of evidence from practicing clinicians that treat in that disease area through your proactive methodology, then that's a much more difficult thing for HTA agencies to battle against. So taking a real proactive stance well in advance, publishing that data and getting that out in the public domain as the means of treating these patients is a great platform, and payers will find that much more difficult to battle against, and you then have a set of evidence that you can use to leverage that.
Right, thanks Jen. So apologies to the people whose questions we weren't able to address. I'm just going to summarize though. So we've taken you through, there's a clear commercial opportunity for single arm phase 2 data that potentially enables early market access. We've talked about a number of the challenges, and we've highlighted how important it is to ensure that regulatory and payer strategies are aligned. The payers are less likely than regulators to accept the limited data packages, and they work with that higher level of uncertainty, and that potentially manifests itself in a trade-off around reduced price. So Jan's taken us through some potential mitigation strategies there from a real-world evidence perspective, and I think to summarize, it's very clear there is a commercial opportunity with phase 2 single arm, but it's a very clear commercial trade-off between earlier access and the likely price you will get with that more limited data package and higher levels of uncertainty. So at that point, I'm going to close the webinar, and Jan and I would like to thank everybody for their attention and questions and attendance. If there are any specific follow-ups, please feel free to drop us a note. You can find our details on the website. Alternatively, we will follow up with the attendees with a note after, so you have our email addresses if you'd like to follow up. Thanks very much, everybody.